Hello, everyone. My name is Andres. I'm visiting Berlin. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very excited. This is my first presentation in Europe. So today we're going to be talking about Angular 2. I built this application. It's like a very small demo. It's called the Angular Guest application. So if you can go to this URL with your phone or your laptop, this is the Wi-Fi, the WLAN, how you call it in Europe. The username and password. So if you can enter your name and tell me something about yourself, you're going to see that this application is going to be showing like cards with contact information and some description of the person who's entering data. And it updates automatically, so you can see the application live before I go into like how we're going to build it. So about myself, I'm from Mexico City. I live in New York. I've been living there for a few years. I've been working with Angular for almost 4 years. I was in the first project at Google that built an Angular application that was used externally. For a long time, we were the largest Angular application in the world until it became like super popular. And of course, we are no longer the biggest one. I work in Google Cloud Storage. I'm a technical lead. I manage a couple of projects. I also run the Angular Meetup in New York. So if you ever visit New York, ping me, because it's like a super popular meetup. It's really hard to get a ticket. Ping me, you can say, okay, I'm coming from Berlin, and you'll get in. I also contribute to the Protractor project. I'm the largest contributor outside of the Protractor team. I built the website. Protractor is a tool to do end-to-end testing for your Angular applications. It's based on WebDriver JS. And today we're going to be talking about this Meetup application. So this application has a couple of views. The first one is where you register, you enter some data. And the second one is like a list of cards. So these are all components. As we saw before, everything is gone in Angular 2. The directives are gone, controllers are gone. Everything is a component. You only have components and services. So if someone can please enter something here, you're going to see like it's going to pop up. It uses Firebase as the backend, so it gets notifications. Anyone? Or maybe it doesn't work. Oh, OK. It works. Awesome. OK. So with Angular 2, the problem is like it's still in alpha. And since it's in alpha, they're working on the API. I've been using Angular 2 for since version 6.5 or something like that. And every time I have to give a presentation about Angular 2, it's different. So you have to throw away some of your code. So be careful if you want to try to use this code, because it's going to change. When I was building this application 3 weeks ago, it was 37. It didn't work for a long time. I tried to update. And this is the first time I have been able to sync with the latest version. So this is fresh from like yesterday. So with Angular 2, you have choice. You can use ES5, which is regular JavaScript, the JavaScript that everyone is using. ES6, or what's the version, ECMAScript 2015, or Typescript. So you can decide what is that you want to use. There are some options that you have and like some difficulties, of course. And since nobody's using Angular 2 yet, there are no patterns. So today we're going to talk about the hottest trend, which is TypeScript. The Angular team wanted to create something called AdScript before they agreed with the TypeScript team that they were going to use this technology. So it's really, really cool. So what IDEs can you use? You can use WebStorm or IntelliJ. WebStorm is my favorite. But you can also use Atom with plugins. Or you can use Visual Studio Code, which is really cool. So I'm going to explain some of the building blocks that I'm going to be using to build this Angular 2 application. And then I'm going to show you the code and how these components fit together. So the first part is ES6 classes. How do you use them? They are, I don't know if you have experience with Node, that you have a file and everything is private unless you export it. So ES6 classes, they look like this. So you have this thing called class, my component, and you have a property, you have a constructor. The constructor is just like the regular constructor that you would have in JavaScript, and you have a function. As you can see, there's not a lot of boilerplate. You don't have like the function keyword or var or stuff like that. And then you have to transpile it, or sometimes they call it compile it. So you grab your ES6 and you turn it into ES5, which is something that your browser is going to interpret. And that's like a building step that you need for your application. It's not like it runs natively, and it's not going to do it for a long time. So when I run this original class through the Typescript compiler, it will give me a regular ES6 JavaScript piece of code. So when you have modules, you have different files. Each file is a module, and you have to export the stuff that's going to be available outside of this file. And then when you use these like external public symbols outside of this file, you have to require them. So the syntax looks like this. Imagine that I have a component that exports this class. So I have to do the export. You can have multiple exports. It can become confusing if you have multiple, so be careful. And you import it like this. Imagine that this file is exporting multiple components, so you can use commands to import them. So you say, I want this symbol and this other symbol, and this is what I'm going to be using in my component. So, components. Everything is gone in Angular 2. The API, the code base, everything is like much smaller. You don't have to learn like so many directives and so many crazy things. So this is how it works. You have a couple of annotations. These annotations are like the add component, add view. And here, there's a couple of important pieces of information. This is like a directive. So in the directive, you have something like a selector. And this is what is going to tell Angular 2, that when you have an HTML tag called Hello Berlin, it's going to say, OK, this is going to fire. This is going to be mapped to a component. So I'm going to be executing this piece of code. You have a view, and you can have a template inline, or you can have a template URL. So you have a reference to an HTML file, which is external. And you have a constructor. So imagine that you have a very, very simple Hello World application in Angular 2. This is what you need. You need to get from Angular 2 three functions. No, one function and two annotations. The first one is component, the second one is view, the third one is bootstrap. Here I'm saying, OK, it's like a ng app that you have in a regular Angular 1 application. So you provide the name, and that's what it uses. So here, for example, when I have a Hello Berlin tag, it will turn it into this markup. Templates. Templates are very, very confusing at the beginning, but there's a very good reason for that. Now, so I'm going to try to explain why. So in Angular 1, you really don't know how, unless you understand like or you have access to the code, how a component or a directive is going to manipulate your input. So you can have something like a literal. This is just a string. It can be an expression, or it can be the result of an interpolation. So unless you know how your component or your directive is going to behave, you really don't know how this is going to be interpreted. Because if it's expecting a regular string, and if you pass this interpolation, probably it's just going to pass like the curly braces. In Angular 2, you bind to attributes. So you bind to properties, not attributes. So the only way to talk to DOM elements when you have markup is attributes. So you have this attribute called title. And in Angular 2, you use these square brackets, which is valid HTML, by the way, but it's kind of ugly. It's like the first time people look at it, it's like, what are they doing? So You bind to this property on the DOM element. So you have access to all of these properties that otherwise wouldn't be available if you use attributes. And if you start using this, you can simplify your code a lot, and you don't have to learn as many Angular directives because you no longer need ngbind and stuff like that. So for example, if you have this div that will have this text inside, you can just use text content. If you just want to bind the inner HTML, you can use this. If you want to hide something, you have ngIf, ngShow, and stuff like that. So you can just use the hidden attribute. So everything has, every DOM element has a hidden property. So this is one ugly thing that Angular 2 has. And the other ugly thing is events. So you have a square bracket, and I'm going to explain why you have that. So imagine you have an Angular 1 expression or a statement. So if you have a component, can you tell me what's the meaning of this? It's like I'm calling the component, and do I select? Does it mean like I have to read the result from this function call? Or should I execute this when I change? So I really don't know how this is meant to be used unless I have access to the code. In Angular 2, you make it very explicit because there are two ways that you can do an expression and a statement. An expression is something that has an output. It's something that produces a value. And a statement is something that performs an action. So in this case, imagine that you have a component that has an event called select. So every time this event gets emitted by this component, it will catch this with the parentheses, and it will execute this function. The other way around is like, okay, I want to bind this select property to the result of this expression. In templates, you have something very, very cool. So you can reference elements from one place to another place in your view. So for example, imagine that you have an input, and when you do something with this button, you want to reference this input from the click event. So you can just give an ID, a name, a unique identifier to your HTML element. So you say hashtag input. And as you can see here, when I click on the button, it's going to focus this input. So that's kind of convenient. So you're all very familiar with ngrepeat. There's a special directive. I don't know if I would call it directive. It's like an Angular 2 thing, because I told you directives are no longer there, so I was lying to you. So this is a directive. It's star ng4. So we saw square bracket, parentheses, hashtag, and then we have star. So those are like the 4 abominations that we have in HTML. It's okay. It's still valid HTML. It's kind of ugly the first time you look at it, but it makes sense. So imagine that I'm iterating through the result of a collection. So I have an array of lists of guests. So this is the actual code that we have in the application. So when you show the cards with all of the guests that entered some data, it's going to go through each one of these, and it's going to call this component called the guest card. The guest card has an attribute, a property called guest. So you're going to pass from the outside world into the inside world of the component. You're going to say, okay, you have this input called guest. I'm going to pass it like this. You have an if, which is an ngIf, and it's exactly the same. It's a star ngIf. So you can have a Boolean condition, and it will show it or not show it. So you have the Typescript compiler. Some people call them transpilers because they're not really compiling anything. But the Typescript compiler grabs your TypeScript code, which is a superset of ES6. So you have like very fancy typings that you can use. Typings are very important once you have a large team. So I've been working with large Angular teams for a long time, and sometimes you have like so many developers. I don't know how many developers are working on my current project, but every time I sync, I get like 250 changes. So we have people in Europe, people in the East Coast, people in the West Coast. People are changing code all over the place. So it's very, very important to have types, because otherwise, when you're using something in the wrong way, there's no way to know, like, okay, this API changed, and this should be breaking, this shouldn't be compiling. Okay, so the architecture of this application is very, very simple. Everything is a component. So the most simple component is the one you saw in the list. It's a card. It has a name, and it has a description. So we call it the guest card. Then we have two components that are a little bit more complex. The first one is called the registration, which is the landing page. And the second one is called guest list, which is where you see like the list of cards, and it has a for, and it shows all of these components. Then I have a very simple service. It's called the guest service that performs all of these actions. So you can list the current collection of guests, and you can create a new one. And under that, there's Firebase, which is a framework that allows you to receive notifications, and it's the one that is doing all of this crazy stuff that you push a change, it gets the notification, it draws the new card. So we're not going to take a look at the Firebase thing unless we have extra time, but it's just regular JavaScript. So the registration component, which is the first part, is the landing page, has three components, or three main pieces. So you have a view that has two inputs. It's an input type text and a text area, a submit button. So it has this component, this service, and it uses Firebase. So the markup looks like this. You have an input, a text area, and a button. So as you can see here, I'm providing IDs. So I can reference these values when I do click. So button, there's a click event. So I'm saying, okay, so when I click on this button, I'm going to be calling a function on my component. So I have a component that has a view part, and it has the JavaScript part, which is Typescript. And it's going to call this function. And as you can see, I'm passing the event, and I'm passing the values of these two inputs. And that's pretty much it. So as you can see, there are many ways to do this. Of course, I could say, I'm going to be binding this to some variable in the component. So in the component, I'm going to have a name and an about input. But here, I just chose to use like the reference of these inputs, because I really don't need that. Okay, so it looks like this. So you have two dependencies from Angular 2. You have component and you have view. You have the selector. The selector is registration. So whenever you see a registration tag, it's going to display this component. And then this is a template URL. So I showed you how to do inline. And this is when you have a reference to an external file. And here, I'm exporting this because it's going to be used somewhere else. And OK, this is where it gets interesting. So I have dependency injection. And as you can see, there's this special keyword in TypeScript. It's called public. And it's going to inject this thing. And it's going to say, OK, guest service. And it's going to include the router as well. This is the Angular router. So whenever I create an instance of this class, I'm going to receive a reference through dependency injection of these two services. So usually you would have a couple of attributes, and you would say, OK, guest service, and then you assign it in the constructor. But this is just a shorthand. I can show you the ES5 code, so you can see like it's very verbose, but it's just a regular assignment. So imagine that you have this guest service equals this other thing. Then here I'm just doing a couple of things. I'm preventing the default from the event, so it doesn't propagate, it doesn't submit the form, it doesn't go to another URL. It's going to the service and it's saying, okay, add this guest, and I'm passing the information that I received from the view. And finally, I'm telling the router, I'm done, let's go to the list. So this is pretty much it. And now the guest list. It's a little bit more complex. It has more components. You have the guest card, which displays a couple of pieces of information. You have the guest list component. You also have the guest service, which is the one that tells you, okay, this is the list of guests. And finally, Firebase. So this is the guest card. This is how it looks. And it's very, very simple. It has a property called guest. So I have a name, and I have a description, and I will show it like this. This looks very, very similar to an Angular 1 template, so nothing surprising. Here, there's something new, which is called properties. In the component, you specify the properties, and that's going to be your API to the world. This is what you are accepting from the outside world to be passed into this component. You have the view, which is a template URL, and that's it. That's all I need to show these two pieces of information. And it looks like this. The guest list, this is a simplified markup piece of code, but it's very, very simple. You have a for, and then you have the guest card. And as we saw, the guest card receives a guest, and I just pass it. Nothing surprising. So here, the syntax is very similar to ngrepeat, but you use this hashtag of. This is the code. This has a little bit more complexity, but not so much. So here, there's something. I told you there are no directives, and people have asked me, okay, you're telling me there are no directives, what's the deal with this thing? So when you are using other components inside your markup, you need to specify a reference to those. Otherwise, they're not going to render. So if you're doing Angular 2 and suddenly your view is not behaving the way it should, if it's just showing the plain like HTML, it's because you are not saying use these directives or components. So you're just saying, okay, I'm going to be grabbing for and guest card, and these are going to be available in this view. Here is the same. I receive the guest service, and it just has a function called getList, and it just returns something from a function call coming from the service. Very simple. So bootstrapping. In Angular 1, bootstrapping is very transparent. So you have your ng app, and that's pretty much it. And you have your module, and you create the dependencies, and that's it. Bootstrapping, they're having like multiple versions, so I don't know. I don't think this is going to be the final state. And there are many ways to do Angular 2, and it's very confusing to do Angular 2, even if you kind of know. And sometimes you have to cheat. So I work at Google, I know the Angular team, so I can ping them. So it's like, listen, how does it work? This breaks. So that's cheating, but it's very confusing. It's not very well documented, but it will be. They're working on docs, and it's going to be amazing. But okay, so don't be super, super scared about this. So System.js is a library that allows you to load different types of modules in JavaScript, because you have common.js and you have, what's the other one, require syntax. And it understands all of these types of modules that you can have in JavaScript, and it will allow you to use them in your application. So here I'm just saying, okay, this is going to be my configuration. This is the set of packages that I'm going to be using, and the default extension is going to be JS. I'm going to be importing this thing, which is a file that I have in my project. And this returns a promise. So it has a then and a catch. So here, I really don't care when its application has been started. I just care when there's an exception. So I'm just logging it to the console. This is how the rest of the component looks. So it's called Hello Berlin. And here in Bootstrap, you're saying, OK, I'm going to be bootstrapping this component. And you have a main component in your application. And probably can have like multiple components. But since there are no best practices, no patterns, I wouldn't be really in a position to recommend you anything. And the second argument to Bootstrap is the set of things that you want to inject. So this is going to be available in all of the child components in this application. So I'm saying, OK, guest service, whenever you need it, this is where you're going to be injecting it. So routing. I've seen several versions of routing. I don't know if this is going to be the final one. Sometimes it's confusing. Sometimes it's super confusing. And sometimes it's OK. So this is how routing works. So you have some directives. But the main deal is it's like when you have ngView in an Angular 1 application. So whenever you're doing your routing stuff, everything is going to end up inside of this tag. So you have the router outlet. And this is when you're navigating. This is going to remain static. And when you go from one route to another one, it's going to end up in this location. You also have these things for the router links. So you're going to say, OK, whenever I click on this link, I want you to somehow find this thing, which is an array. And I don't understand why. It used to be a regular name. And it's going to go to the registration page, or it's going to go to the registration page, the guest list page. So this is how you configure it. There's yet another annotation, which is called the router config. So you can provide a path, a name, and a component. So obviously, I'm requiring all of these components. I'm importing them. The rest is the same. And then you have directives. It's been changing a little bit. So here, there's this variable called router directives, which comes from the router component in Angular 2. And I'm saying, OK, I need this extra couple of things. Here, I'm saying router bindings. This is one of the dependencies that is going to be available in my application. And then this is new. This is new in 42. It wasn't available before. It used to be called bind. So in Angular 1, everything is like unique. You have a name, and you can only have like one type for this name. In Angular 2, you can provide like multiple different bindings, so you have more flexibility. So the way you bind stuff is by using the provide function, and you have like this very weird syntax. So you can provide constants, or you can provide classes. So here, what I'm saying is use the hashtag whenever you're referring to different routes. So when you go to the URL, you can see hashtag list and hashtag nothing. So that's pretty much it. If you want to see code, I can show you. So what do we want to see? The guest card?
The complicated stuff.
This is the guest card once you compile it. So it's not pretty, but it's kind of readable. So this is how it would look in ES5. So you have, from Angular 2, you have component, and you have view. And this is how you would configure. Obviously, it wouldn't have so much boilerplate. I know, it's horrible. I can show you the guest service. So this is something very, very simple. It uses Firebase. So this is my hard-coded URL. There's an interface, which I'm calling guest. This obviously is not going to be part of the output. It's just for typing. So here I'm just saying, okay, in the guest service, I have a reference to Firebase, and I have a list of guests. It's just a regular array. So as you can see, I have typings here. And in the constructor, I'm initializing Firebase with my URL, and I'm registering for some events. So you have a basic CRUD, create, read, update, delete. So every time something happens, I just update the array. There's not a lot of stuff going on here. So as you can see, I have these arrow functions, which is pretty cool. I don't have to say, like, this is my function callback. I like that. It does the binding to this, so you don't have to bind this function. So it's pretty cool. So here I'm just adding the newly added guest at the beginning. Here I'm just finding it and removing it. When you change something, I'm just updating it. And when you add, you just say Firebase push. I will get a notification. It will get added. And get list, I will just return the array. So is there anything else you would like to see? I don't know if we are running out of time. Sebastian, time?
Sorry, yeah.
Are we good?
We can, I don't know.
Yes.
We have like 15 minutes.
Okay, so questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I have a small question about the plans of the roadmap. Can give us some information when it's planned to put Angular 2 into production ready?
So Angular used to be like a very small team. It was Mishko, Vojta, and Igor, and the manager, Brad. And they moved really quickly. And now it's like, I don't know anymore. There are like 20 people. Every time I check, there's a new team member. They have never built a large application. So right now they're working on an application at Google that's using Angular 2. So obviously they're discovering a few things because once you practice your own framework, you find stuff. So they said it was going to be ready by fall, and it's fall. So yes. It's Alpha 42.
But you don't have any more specific?
No, I'm pretty sure that Angular Connect, they're going to come up with, like, Brad is going to give the keynote and he's going to say, okay, it's going to be ready soon. Or maybe they're going to come with beta is going to come, or no idea. But wait, don't use it yet. You can start learning it multiple times. Yes. Any more questions? Yes, in the back.
Yeah, I mean, just on first look, the syntax looks really ugly. Can we get really good performance increases?
It's incredibly fast. If you look at the performance metrics, it's like they show you like other frameworks, and this one is super fast.
Yeah.
And also the amount of stuff you need to learn is very little. So in Angular 1, there are so many directives because HTML is kind of weird. So for example, there's one for ng source when you have an image. So you don't have to do that anymore because, of course, you would load the view and it would say, it would see these curly braces, and it would try to load this image, and the URL doesn't exist, of course. And then until that binding becomes available, then it can load again. So you have these quirky things, and you don't need them anymore because you have access to the DOM. Just learn your DOM, and that's it. Any more? Yes, in the back.
Do you have any experience debugging Angular 2 application?
Yes, so you can create maps. And when you have a map, you can have access to the original code. So imagine that I'm debugging this. So start. I'm just starting the application, so there's nothing to see. So imagine that I have something like this, child added. So this one, probably I have to turn it into, do I have it in Spanish, probably? Yes. Weird. Okay, so I'm going to set a debugger here. And when I reload this thing, oh, sorry, of course. Oh. Yeah, demos, sorry. Okay, here, I'm going to go to the list. And as you can see, I'm generating a map file that, given your JavaScript that is being executed by the browser, is going to map back to the original. So here you have the ability to debug Typescript, even if Typescript is not real. Typescript is just like the source of your application. And this is how you can debug it. So it's really nice. If you don't have the mapping, it will take you to the regular JavaScript file. So that's it. I know people are very, like, I don't know, scared about this TypeScript thing and compiling stuff, but I've been compiling my application for a long time, so I'm no longer scared. Any more questions? Okay. Thank you so much.